times.
So before we get too far into this, why don't we do? So let's do the shill first. So why don't you tell people who you are, what you do, and where people can find you?
All right. So if anyone there might be people that know me, there might be people that don't. Hi everyone. My name is Melanie. I'm an obnoxious fucking communist personality on the internet. Um, basically, I just hang around and shit post, and I really just hang around the lefty scene. Sometimes I sit on panels. Basically, sometimes I do interviews, or if people want to ask me like, "Hey, like, how do I feel about X thing?" In that has to deal with socialism, I basically just come on and talk about it. That's really it. So most of my Twitter is a shit talk.
Base?
Like in a shit post, but there are some gems of things that I genuinely believe in, and like those are like the more longer posts. So like if like I just like just please take my Twitter for what it is. Like it's not that deep ever. But that's really the main thing that I do. um Eventually I'm gonna stream. I don't know when that's gonna be. I've been trying to figure out my schedule, but I'm gonna eventually figure that out. Someone in chat said the Joshua for Congress. Yeah, I know. I keep hearing that all the time. Like, fuck. So yeah, if you know me from that, cool. You've heard me yell at other people.
Based.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm a
sorry. Go
fun
ahead.
person. But
Well,
yeah, that's just really it.
I posted your
Uh,
link in chat for anyone who wants to follow you.
yeah, if anyone wants
Um,
to follow my ass on Twitter, let me post this on.
I'm sure.
Um, Let me like make a Twitter thing. I guess. I don't know. I don't really advertise.
Well, I mean, it's up to you. It's my stream. You don't need to advertise it.
Yeah, but I always will in case anyone wants to.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
All right. Because I feel like if anyone wants to watch us talk, they totally can. Okay. Cool.
So I guess now, so we got the shilling out of the way. So if we had to describe our positions, what would be your fundamental position on? So like, let's say, for the sake of the argument, that we totally share the goal and what socialism is. We like have the exact same definition. I think that a lot of the differences that happen here are how we get to that goal. So generally, the revolutionary and the reformist debate is like one of those big methods questions. What do you think are the big takeaways from how you think that we need to get to socialism? Particularly if you think there's differences like first world versus third world, violence versus nonviolence, revolution versus non-revolution, stuff like that. How do we get from here to socialism?
So my prescription is always like mass line and material conditions. So what does the collective, or like what are the main basic needs of the workers in the part of the world that are trying to do the revolution? So like
Wake up, liberal.
what the things
I
that we are
love you.
advocating for the most in the United States, generally speaking, are like healthcare,
Wake up,
like
liberal.
stable
I love you.
wages, housing, like food equality, financial and land equity. Those are all things that we all kind of want. I think everyone can agree that those are all things that we would want to some extent, regardless of
Mm-hmm.
your um, intersection. So like, it doesn't matter whether you're white or black, poor or rich. I think everyone in America has the same
Mm-hmm.
sort of ideals of happiness, like the core tangents of what we want, like a simple, stable life with access to education and healthcare. Unfortunately, in the first world, the Western world, and a lot of the global North, those things are very much like they're very much inflated, right? So like you have people, the majority of everyone is at the very bottom, and then there's a very small amount of people at the very top.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the third world it's a little bit different, because a lot of those industries and a lot of those things a lot of those structures didn't exist because they were either not solid and not there, or they were destabilized and destroyed by colonizers, people who imperialized, or disputable governments. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a lot easier for a Maoist or an insurrection or a vanguard that is armed to take more territory or to gain something in a place where there aren't structures to like solidify those things, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the first world where there's already structures, like there's already things in the way, there's already roadblocks. So it's a lot harder for people to like, I don't think that anyone in modern day America is gonna get a bunch of people with guns, storm a building, and take like that's not like an armed
Mm-hmm.
revolution is just not
Well, they just did
physically
it 2 weeks
feasible.
ago, right? Can't we just do it again?
That's not, but that wasn't
I
an
understand. I'm
insurrection.
joking.
Wake up,
Okay, okay,
liberal.
okay.
I love you.
I think a lot of people, when they think of revolution that is armed, they think of like a bunch of people like with Mosins like storming the Winter Palace. Like that's the yes, that was a very conditional thing for the Bolsheviks, but it's never like it's just never going to happen in the States. Um, we
So,
need sort of
sorry.
a combination of both, and it needs to be disseminated with the people leading that. Um, and usually it's the people at the bottom that would be leading that. So if I when I think of politics, when I think of socialist politics, I always think of the most marginalized people basically saying, "Hey, these are our baseline needs that we need met." And then the people that have more privileges and more access to needs and like goods and resources can say, "Hey, if I'm not getting enough of these things, then these people are clearly getting none of these things. So how can we make this equitable? We should probably listen to these people and see if we can meet their needs in a more uh, how do I explain this? Like
Wake up,
if we can
liberal.
immediately
I love you.
directly meet their needs, then by transitively we're meeting everybody's needs because we are also elevating them, which elevates us, and we stair step.
Hmm.
And that's like the basic frame. That's how I would frame this. Now, how we go about physically doing these things is a
Well, so
whole
if I
nother
could
conversation.
interject just to try and get at
Sure.
that, if you had to list out a series of steps, so it sounds to me like you're talking more about revolution of the third world. So why don't we focus there? What would be like the steps for now to revolution? Like
Like
step one,
specifically
do
for the first
something.
one.
Step two, do something. Step three, do
Oh,
something, and
I
then
guess,
now
I guess, I guess.
socialism.
Let me
They can be broad
recontextualize this. Like,
steps.
I'm not a third worldist. Like, I'm
Okay.
not for Maoism. Like, I think Maoism is something that I think there's a lot of things to learn from Maoism, and there's a lot of things, but I think Maoism is a very specific thing that like tends to happen in places that have less infrastructure. But
Hmm.
there's a lot of techniques and things I think from Mao that makes sense, especially in combating like propaganda and sort of like keeping people together and not like falling into cultural pitfalls and like respecting the needs of everyone. Oh shit, that's my
No
alarm that was
worries.
supposed to let me know. That's very loud. I'm so sorry.
You don't need to apologize. This stream is
Um,
used to poor audio quality.
yeah. So I guess let me reframe that. Like I'm just giving an example of things that like
Hmm.
have happened in other places. I don't necessarily prescribe to that idea because I don't think that those things are 100% tangible. Um, in Turtle Island, which isn't to say that Maoists that are not operating within this part of the world are not like not doing good work or anything. It's that uh
So I
It's
guess
that we're very fractured. Like there like there's no sort of collect so like I think the first thing that you would have to do in the first world, in terms of getting everyone together is you have to identify all of the needs of what people are trying to do because like individualism doesn't necessarily work. So like so let me ask you this. How do you feel about individualism versus the collective if we're looking at reform versus revolution?
so. I'd be happy to get on that. I just really want to press you on the like, what do you think the steps are to get there? We can do just to finish that one up first. And if you don't
Oh,
think
sure.
it's particular to one context, like what's the more generalized theory of how to get to revolution? Or if you want to pick a context like the United States, since that seems to be where we both
I
live.
mean, even if it's so like I would say that like from revolution even to reform, it doesn't matter whether we're doing revolution or reform. The steps are basically like you need to identify like it's really just making sure everyone knows what the mass line is. So it's just going through step by step and identifying the needs of like every single person and then generalizing them to where these are all capable of being met. And
Sure.
a
So
lot of it
step
has to
one,
do
we've
with
identified
power,
people's needs.
right?
Step
A lot of it has
two.
so power. So like
Hmm.
how do we consolidate power for people? So because power doesn't exist in a void. So you have to find ways, how do we get people into positions of power? Do we do this locally? Do we do this with like a physical force of people? Do we do this
Hmm.
with a combination of both? Do we do this electorally or do we do this with like, fucking guns and ammo and swords and shields? Like like this can be done any other way. Like the framework of vanguardism, the framework of revolution and reform is just it's the same step no matter what. It just changes conditionally on what location, who is involved, and what everyone is trying to do.
Well,
That's
those seem to be then pretty different steps in different contexts, right?
I mean,
Like
Yeah.
I guess
Are you looking for like my prescriptive one-step program? Because that's
it,
not really how this works. Like
well,
like
I guess I'm
vanguardism
just
is a framework. It's not a cut and paste. Here are the 5 ways to do the revolution. It is identifying broadly all of these things together and sort of going through what is effective and what works. Because a lot of times, like, you're going to hit roadblocks. Like, the reason why it is so kind of loose is because the collective is supposed to lead the idea. And so it wouldn't work if you were to have, because this one step-by-step program is not going to work with everybody, because it can fall into commandism, where a bunch of people start telling people what to do by the barrel of a gun, and that's not good. It can fall into Taoism, where it's just like one person who like is in charge of like a business. So like, say like the worker collective takes over like Amazon, like they
Mhm.
take over the warehouses, but the people in power, they become the de facto CEOs, or the people that own that system of that institution, and they want to start making all the rules through Taoism or Taylorism that forces everyone else to like go in line. And that's not a collectivist response, and it's not even an individualistic response. So even on like a Maoist or an anarchist like tendency, that wouldn't work. Um,
Sure. So
so
I
when I
guess then
so
okay,
again,
sure.
when I think of reform versus revolution and vanguardism in general,
Hmm.
it is all it's not a you can't there's not a data sheet for this. There is not a 5-step program to get us here. It is just a toolkit. And I think people are too hung up on, like, when people always ask, well, what do you need to do? And I'm like, what is to be done? Like, what how do I do this? It's like, well, I mean, first of all, you have to start talking to people. You have to find communities. You have to help inform the masses. Like, if the masses were so smart, like, we all know that capitalism is bad, right? Like, we can all sit here and go, capitalism sucks. America is like, Jeff Bezos makes 2K a second. Like, we all know
Hmm.
this. And so, like, it's not that the masses are stupid, and it's not that people don't want to do anything. It's not that no one it's not that no one is coming to these terms that capitalism is bad. It's that there just isn't a collective force. And so what the vanguard and what reform, and even like what like even a soc dem, like getting
Hmm.
everyone to caucus for socialism at local power, that, like, things that like Rosa Luxemburg liked to do. um, Lenin and Luxemburg both stood by the same ideas, that whether it's reform or revolution, it has to have the collective mass line, has to lead it. It needs to be led by marginalized people, and it needs to emphasize the idea of, we are trying to not individualize struggle but collectivize struggle. Um, I mean, I'm not really
Sure.
quite sure like how this like what you want out of
Well, so I guess
out of this.
the thing that I was trying to get at with these questions, and I will probably do a little more interjection just to keep it more even sided, I guess,
Yeah,
um,
no, that's fair.
is like, what are the differences? So I guess I tend to come towards a very reformist side of things, and I'm trying to ask, if you first, the classic question is, do you see these things as incompatible? How would you define revolution, and is it incompatible with, like, say, working through the electoral process? Because there are some
No,
people.
no. Why would I ever think that I am not anyone that thinks reform is over revolution is ridiculous. Like, again, like, you kind of need them both in tandem, especially like in this part, like especially in the United States. You
Sure.
can't
So I guess the question then
so
becomes, like, let's say we do the reform, right? The United States is now a sock down country. It becomes as Finland, or it becomes as Sweden, right? Like, what step then do we take that would differentiate a reformist and a
if
revolutionary?
well, okay, well, okay, so this is where our disconnect is.
Hmm.
I don't like this idea of making, like, why is your solution of a SOCDEM country Sweden or Finland? Why can't you, like, do you
They just have the
like
most
that's
policies that fit into that. Like, the third world SOCDEMs generally have a more sporadic and, like, usually less well fit mixture of policies.
right, but like most people, okay, I guess I'm trying to understand your historical framework. So, like, do you know much about like 1920s Germany and like what was going on in Poland and stuff at the time?
Uh, probably reasonably well. What in particular are you just trying to say that Soc Dems will fight like with communists if there's a revolution?
No. I don't necessarily think that. I just like, is this like an ideological thing that like I'm just trying to figure out like where our disconnect is? Because I don't think like I don't want a world that's like if we did a complete reform, like so like
Well, so I guess to provide like the steps that I think about when I think about how to achieve socialism as much towards the reform side is like step one, as you say, obtain power. Generally, that's through a combination.
I'm not against reform. Like so like this is something
Well,
okay. So like
here, let me just finish out these
like,
steps.
I
Okay.
want to say one thing. Like this is
Okay.
the thing that I'm trying to get here because I'm not quite sure what you mean. Like because the first question you asked me was hard to answer because I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. So like I don't think reform
Shouldn't the
is
question be
bad.
true regardless? Like, shouldn't your answer of how to do revolution be true regardless of who you're talking to?
Well, kind of, but your framework is interesting because like I don't necessarily think that I don't think that reform is bad. Like it seems like you're trying to assume that I am just
Well,
for
no,
revolution.
that's something that so there are some people
Okay,
who are
okay.
so pro-revolutionary that oppose reform. So, for example, I talked to I want to
No,
say
no,
about a month ago
I'm
two
not
people who
against
call
I'm not
themselves Maoists, principally like Marxist-Leninists, principally Maoists, who said like any voting for elections is bad. There's a guy in my server who like constantly says you shouldn't vote, burn ballot boxes, stuff like that. Guy's insane, from my opinion, because he seems to be destroying a source of worker power.
Is he saying okay, let me ask you this. Is he saying all electoralism though? Is what about localized power? Like
Yeah,
is he
probably.
read Mao? Has he read Lenin? Like this this is the thing. It's like you're like if
Well, I'm just trying to ask. I'm just trying to pin down roughly where you are. And so, if you're in the side which is like, as Luxembourg
I
was,
literally said at the
Luxembourg
very
said,
beginning, I'm not.
no,
I literally said I'm okay with both of them.
yeah,
I'm
that's
just confused.
good.
Like, okay, like you need to also understand that like a guy that says they're an MLM is going to have a predisposition
Mm-hmm.
to want to be more of a pro-insurrectionist. Like you should have known that going in. Like you should know that. Like
I
that's a very
I do.
101 thing.
Yeah, I know. I'm not trying to. This is not like an
Oh,
attack. I'm just trying to describe this.
No,
So
I'm just
the
making sure
process
you know.
here is
Like, no, I'm just making sure you understand because like it just comes off like you're like assigning me a position.
I'm
Like,
literally just trying to figure out where you are. So I
yeah,
apologize if
no,
that comes off as attacking.
I'm pretty neutral. Like, no, I'm pretty neutral. Like, like this is like the problem with the reform versus revolution. It's a very post-left conversation. So
Can you clarify that?
like we can sit here like I mean I guess what my I guess the thing that I think is really funny about this
Mm-hmm.
is like it's so fucking conditional
Mm-hmm.
like like do you think that like we just can only do this through reform? I guess let me ask you this. Do we think
Well,
we can just only
Wake
do
up,
this through
liberal.
reform,
I
or do
love
you
you.
think like a mixed way of doing this is like untangible?
sure, that's what I was trying to say with the steps before. So the idea is that in the first
Okay,
world,
sorry.
where revolution has been incredibly unsuccessful, there's been not one successful socialist revolution in a liberal democracy. The rate of revolution has enormously declined. It seems unreasonable to believe that a genuine violent revolution, akin to either like a palace coup or like a 1917 style, is going to succeed in the first world. So in the first world, the only reasonable route seems to be a combination of like dual power, stuff like strikes, worker power, and local power, and electoral success, which in combination raise worker power and decrease capitalist power. So step one is like power, and then the remainder of the steps are basically iterations on that. You should use that power to take the power from the capitalists and give it to the workers. You should want in some way to try and transfer wealth or power from those who have a lot of wealth to those who have very little. And over time, the idea is that this will incrementally make it easier and easier to come to a point at which you can take all of that and essentially abolish class. That's the hyper simplified version.
Yeah. But it hasn't seemed to really but it hasn't really seemed to work anywhere else. Like both of our examples are have still not worked. So like even if I was for like like for example, like even if I was for like 100% armed revolution,
Mm-hmm.
for example, like I like that's kind of a fever dream. Like you also just like described a fever dream.
Well, that's the thing, though, because it's what we've actually been seeing happening.
If your closest example to Sockdem paradise is like a Finland or a Norway, we're still like miles away.
Well, yes and no. So, like, part of so there's this book. There's these two economists. One is called Darren Acemoglu. It's spelled Acemoglu. I can send you the link. He's the guy. You know the famous book. You probably even seen memes. Why Nations Fail. He wrote the book.
Mhm.
His main theory for more or less the entire change of institutions that we've seen since the First World War is that the rich made a bargain, which is that they would give the poor people democracy, which in the short term didn't take much of their wealth, but in the long term has been slowly destroying their wealth and slowly increasing equality of society. And so he calls this like the long bargain. That's not his precise term. That's how I think of what he calls it. Sorry. So the idea here is that this is precisely what we've been seeing happening over time. Like the enormous size of the welfare state has increased. There's been a neoliberal stagnation, but we also saw one of the fastest declines in inequality in all history during like the Sakdem and in like the revolutionary periods of these times. Both of these methods seem to have achieved like enormous steps in this direction. So I don't think that the fact that they failed, like temporarily, is actually a strong argument against them. But it is actually a much stronger argument against revolution, because when the revolutions have failed, they failed in the way like the USSR has failed or the PRC has failed, where the revolution has totally collapsed. Now the Russia is to the right of most countries in the first world, and PRC, which is authoritarian and even more unequal than many countries in the first world.
Yes, but I guess I don't like to. But the thing is like I don't. When I say that both of our sides have failed, I'm not trying to say that like I don't think the USSR and China are like are any more successful examples of like what we would call like authoritarian socialism, as opposed to like say like Sweden. Like I like this whole like weird competition of like which is better and which is worse is like they're both just like moot arguments. Because like we're still not to socialism. Like I don't care.
Well, sure, but that's
these are conversations that don't matter.
So would you agree that socialism is like a gradient?
No, because like we can sit here all day and atomize like what Sweden has done, what America has done, what China has done, and we can just go back and forth on every policy, every single thing. I could go on about how like Dengism is like kind of okay, but also not okay. Like we can atomize individual ideologies. We can do this all the time.
Sure,
But
I get.
but that doesn't get to the crux of both of these things both of these solutions have not worked. They have not gained us any equality. They've just gained us partial equality. So
Well, that's actually the point that I was trying to get at. So if partial equality, I asked, is socialism a gradient? Is it possible that there's a system that's like at zero socialism and that you can get closer or further? Or is it either you're socialist or you're not? It's binary. And you don't need to have a firm stance. It's just, this seems to be how a lot of people think about it, where it's either you've gotten to socialism and that's when you've done it, you've won, but then there's nothing in between. Anything short of that, if you got 99% of the way there, it doesn't count. So I'm kind of trying to understand how you think about these things.
Oh, okay, all right. I guess I don't necessarily think that it is binary, but like I'm saying, if we're talking about it, we're talking about it in like pure terms. Like if we're trying to just say like if we're trying to okay, so generally like if we're trying to define successes, like when I think about socialism, I'm not looking at like gradients of like what is good and what is bad. I'm thinking of how are we getting here versus how are we not getting here. So like how on track are we to getting to this place?
Sure. So you could think of that as just to extend it, right? In a gradient, for like a variable, there can be like the derivative, the slope of that. And so you aren't just interested in how close are we to socialism. You're interested in what is the direction of that variable. Are we getting closer? Right.
Like when I think of communism, like socialism isn't the win condition. Socialism is the step. So like we're not even to socialism yet. Like we're getting there. We're slowly kind of like we're breaking down class strata. We're getting, people to realize that the capitalist class is bad. Like we're slowly getting to these places. But like I would even make the argument that like we're not even like to like even socialism. Like even a lot of countries are just barely there. And so
I don't know that any country is there. I guess the reason.
Cool.
So the reason that this is relevant.
I'm glad we're here. Okay.
Well, the reason this is relevant is when we're trying to gauge the success of a country. If the only success that we accept is absolute 100% success, it becomes very hard to question how good other countries are. So, like, let me give an example. So in Finland, they have de facto eliminated homelessness. Depending on how you want to define it, there are currently 500 homeless people in Finland, which is about 1 in 11,000. De facto, it's gone. There just aren't homeless people in Finland. If that's the metric for like homeless reduction, then every other country is a failure. But clearly, that's not how I think we'd want to evaluate homelessness, which is this tiny issue compared to the rest of the
I mean,
entire
there's still
economy.
500 houseless people in
Well,
Finland, so like.
okay, we can quibble. Maybe Finland's also a failure, right? But I guess the point that I'm trying to bring up is that thinking about it in this way, I don't think is very helpful. The goal here is to think about how close you are
No,
to
I don't.
ending
I don't.
homelessness, right?
Right. I don't think that though. Like, I'm. The only reason why I said that, like, the only reason why I said that is because you brought up that, like, you said that, like, well, the USSR and China are failures, and like Finland is like slightly better, so that means that's what we should do. And I'm like,
Well,
I just think that's a bad way of looking at socialism,
that's actually
because like
precisely. Sorry, go ahead.
I just personally have always it doesn't matter whether you said it or if anyone says that like the Scandinavian countries are way better. That
Hmm.
they have gotten to socialism closer than like say like the PRC or like the USSR.
Hmm.
I think that's just a silly thing to say. Anyone saying that, I find that just really silly.
Well,
Um,
so I think that there's two things here.
as much as I find people that think that like the USSR was like the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that like the People's Republic of China is like still like they are the communist vanguard that we should all like look up for, like hail Xi Jinping.
Hmm.
I think both of those viewpoints are really stupid because
Okay.
they completely devoid the nuance of any sort of conversation we had about both of those kinds of ideologies. Does
Well,
that
sure.
help?
So that's actually precisely what I'm trying to get at a little bit here. It's that I don't think that I'm just trying to say, hey, this country got closer. It's also about the direction of those. So the idea is that when we look at like social democratic countries, their failures are like, hey, we got to like 60% socialism and then we went back to like 50%. I know this is hypersimplified, but that change is not very small. And the question is one of direction. And in the long run, and I can send you, there's this really neat graph of, for example, like the rise of the welfare state. There are dips and there are troughs. But the long run is like starkly positive. So the question is about the direction. When we look at the direction of like say post USSR Russia, the direction seems to be very starkly negative. It's authoritarian, it's reactionary, and it's economically right wing. That like Navalny is not by any means like a leftist alternative to Putin or anything. There doesn't seem to be any feasible left wing alternative in Russia, despite it being so incredibly right wing that they legalized domestic abuse, that they legalized like beating gay people.
So
Um,
you think that because so socialism failed in the USSR because Russia is now a right-wing paradise? Is that what you're trying to
it's
say?
that the comparison is that the slope for Russia, the slope for the post-revolutionary states, is so starkly like anti-socialist almost, as compared to the SOCDEM countries, where it's like they bent it to like stagnation, but they
But
didn't
did
bend
you
it like
but I
starkly against.
what about all the historical things that happened to the USSR within the lead up, like all the internal workings, the things that were happening with the war in Afghanistan and like the
Hmm.
United States interventions? Like there are other things that curtailed into that. Like
So I'm not
it's
trying to
like
say that like revolution necessarily fails. The question is simply of like the data that we have, because we're trying to look at, if you want to be like a
but
historical materialist or whatever, then what we are currently looking at is like revolutions that were attempted and how they turned out. And so I would argue that there's a reason for why the revolution failed, but regardless of why, it didn't seem to be very successful.
like okay, but what about okay, so like we can talk. I don't but yeah, I love you, dude, but like I
Hmm.
don't care about like I really don't care about how the post-revolutionary got Russia into a hellhole, because that doesn't matter. I don't I think the hardest part
Well, sure.
about this
Then I guess what data
conversation,
should we look at, right?
I
Like,
I don't want to look basically when I'm trying
mhm.
to determine how we should do socialism like at
Wake
all,
up, liberal. I
I
love you.
generally just look at what is successful in every single country. So like if there is something from reform that we can take away from Sweden that we can apply to the United States, let's fucking do that. If there is a revolutionary armed thing that we can take from fucking I don't know, fucking Mozambique that
Hmm.
was six, or some kind of intersectional thing that they did as a collective that works in the United States that we can co-opt, or like a slogan or a sticky phrase or something that like worked with the people, like I don't know, peace, land, and bread. Taking a good examples of positive things from revolution historically, whether it's empirically or anecdotally, and trying to see if we can apply these in the United States. I don't care about the results of post like I said, this seems to me like we're falling into a a post left conversation. I don't, like I said, I don't
Well,
care about like what has happened to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. Like it's fine. Like we're not in control of that. We can't do anything. There's nothing to be gained from that shit.
Well, so it's actually precisely
America is still essentially a neoliberal fucking hellhole. How do we fix the United States? Like, you keep looking, like, if you want to look for
But that's
other,
actually
if
precisely
you're
the
still-
point, right? Like, if you're
Right.
saying we should look at what works in other countries, the question is, how do we know if it works? And the goal then is you have to tie it to some outcome. And so what I'm trying to
It
suggest is
doesn't
that,
always have to be outcome. Just
well, then how would you
because, okay,
determine
so
whether something
conditionally-
works, right?
conditionally, we can conditionally say the Bolshevik Revolution was successful. Was it long-termly successful? Well, no, but like, who gives a shit whether it was long-term successful? What things worked from that we can fucking take and bring back here that actually is fucking effective?
But if
Like,
it's not
what-
long-term successful and it takes a long time to get to socialism, then it seems like it doesn't meet the goal, right?
Well,
Like,
the-
let's
well,
say
the
that
conditions
we
is-
we
well,
can
the
do a
con- well, the
revolution and it
conditions-
gives us
well, the
100 years of
conditions historic-
socialism, but we need
no, the
200,
conditions
so it
in-
doesn't matter, right?
It does matter because the conditions historically in 1917 are not the same conditions and they're not the same outcomes as they are in like 2021. So it is really like antithetical to say, well, okay, we don't have.
Well,
we don't
sure,
have
but you were
data
just saying that
prove
we want to
there's
look
a
at things that work
long-term-
universally, right? So like I think the
Right.
whole thing that we're trying to do here is like, if the goal is to look at what works universally, then I guess I would bust out the studies then, and I would say like, hey, there's a lot of evidence that like armed violent actions tend to turn people away from the movement, and it seems like instead non-violent dual power and like electoral success are very successful at getting people on your side.
Okay, but America's revolution was inherently right. Was inherently like a more right wing revolution.
Sure,
right?
but
And that was
the
considered
context of
successful.
American's revolution, if we want to talk about this, was in 1770s, right? It was like
Right.
2.5 centuries ago. It is not relevant to like modern armies or modern states.
Yes, it is. It's completely relevant because people are still talking about that. There are so many fucking history.
People
nerds that
talking about it
jerk
doesn't make it
off-
relevant.
It doesn't. It does because there's so many nerds that jerk off to the American Revolution all the time. Like all those
they're
right-wing
wrong.
militia groups, they still jerk off to it. It doesn't matter. Culturally, they're still inclined that that's how they view revolution. There are people in the States that still view it that way. Just because you don't view it that way because you are viewing it from a very academic lens, the common person isn't thinking about it in that framework. Again,
Sure,
like,
but
there's
so I guess
frameworks
I'm
you have
trying to
like-
tie this, like, so the common person thinks about it in a certain way, and then there's like what we as like people who are trying to approach this scientifically should think is true about how to achieve our goals, right? So like, why should it matter what the common person thinks about what's an effective way to achieve our goals if we know that it's like objectively not a good way to achieve our goals? I guess more generally, I would just note, like, even in the United States, right? A lot of the studies that I'm talking about are ones that show that when people are violent in the United States, it turns people off. People don't like being involved in violent movements in the United States either.
Well, like, who is leading well, you also have to look at who is leading these violent things. Most of the people that are leading these violent things are usually like fringe right-wing, predominantly white groups. And anytime marginalized people ever do something that is considered violent, they're
Mhm.
repressed by the state at a level that is completely unheard of. Like, look at the Black Panthers. They were all murdered. Like, they actually consolidated local power legally, defended themselves legally, and then the state legislated some of the harshest gun control laws in the United States to take those guns away from minority groups and put more guns in the hands of the state and people with power and capital and money. So no,
Well, yes. So then the
people are
question
not-
is, why
people are not-
is
people
that
are
a
not
successful
scared- no,
tactic?
people aren't scared of violence. They're scared of the violent. They're not.
But then they
scared of
voted for the
violence.
people who took away those guns, right? Like the state didn't. The state isn't this monolith which just
The
chooses to
state
take
took
away your
those
guns.
people's
The state
because
was
they were
elected.
black. No, the state took away those people's guns because they were black people with guns, not because they were white folks with guns.
Sure.
Because
So
armed white supremacists have more support in the United States historically than any other group that's necessarily had guns, right? So like even in the fucking military, dude, people were more concerned with gangs than they were white supremacy. Like,
sure. So I can
like-
agree that these are all bad outcomes. The question is why they occurred. And so what I'm trying to suggest is like there's actually literally a study on this that after MLK there were a variety of like nonviolent protests and
MLK was still in favor of doing things in the same regard that the Panthers were doing. He just knew that optically that wasn't the right thing to do.
well, but that's actually
like-
precisely the point because optics is part of a successful movement, right? You were just mentioning peace, land,
Because he
bread,
knew-
right? Which was
because
the
he knew
optics
that
of
if
Lenin,
he
right?
knew that if he went hard, he was going to get executed. but he was
Well, yeah,
killed
and
by
so
the
then why
FBI.
go
So it
hard
didn't
if you'll
matter.
lose?
So it didn't fucking matter, dude. It didn't
Well,
matter if he did anything peaceful because he was still shot, and then his
yeah,
legacy got totally
but that's actually
like
precisely the argument, right? If doing this
that's
gets
not
us
precisely.
killed, if doing this gets us killed and our movement crushed for like 30 years, why do it?
Oh my god.
Will we do it better this time? Will we win?
It's not about it being better. It's about materially who was involved, right? Obviously, if we have
Well,
an like
is the
with
goal to have a good movement or is the goal to win? I guess is the question.
but it's not about like communists don't approach socialism as a win condition. This isn't something you can just like fucking plug into a data sheet and go look at proportionally all of the data that we have to win. Like I don't.
Sure, so I can understand that like communism, this utopia of like post-scarcity is a nice goal to shoot for. The question is how do we get closer to that? And so if the right crushes a violent leftist movement, which is seen as scary, and people move over to the right as a result, that probably moves us further away. I don't think that's very hard logic to follow.
Martin Luther King was executed and people by the state, and then people rioted. People
I don't.
literally
Is that true?
people did the direct action, and then an amendment was passed. Like dual power does work on the principle of MLK's existence. You have someone that is advocating for something peaceful
So
because he has no choice, because he has been forced in that position at the will of the state because the state owns a monopoly on violence.
well,
You
sure.
have
So
people
then,
you have people that are also trying to take localized power, as in like they have guns, they're trying to defend themselves because they're a bunch of marginalized black folks in the deep south advocating for civil rights while also getting violence by the state. There are these two things happening simultaneously, and then both of these groups were still murdered in cold blood and still killed, and then amendments were passed after all of these people died, and those amendments and those laws that were passed have barely given us rights that we are still barely fighting for today. So like it
so
doesn't none of it. You can say all you want how this conflates your argument, but it doesn't seem to have like done anything for either of us because we're still not there.
well,
Like we
so
barely have gotten anything. Like
I just want to be clear.
we have a bunch of black folks that have fought for something harder than any of the working class white folks in this country, and they died for it and got nothing.
Wait, so
Like
I'm just not. I'm not. It feels like there's a contradiction in your argument.
Quantify that in a data? Like what?
Well, sure. I mean, so I'm just trying to be clear on your argument. Is your argument that like movements like the Black Panthers were successful? That movements like not movements, direct action, like violent direct action after the MLK, the assassination of MLK, that these were effective because they got legislative success, they got policy change, which therefore ultimately helped build a less racially segregated, less racially problematic society in the United States today. Is that your argument, or is the argument that it didn't work? Like, I guess the argument is were these movements successful or not?
Well, it was successful as in like it challenged the hegemony and it started to work, but the fact of the matter is they didn't have mass support. So the issue is like when we have such a marginalized group of black folks that were like they were the ones saying, "Hey, we have an effective method." They were doing things like they did the Black Panthers did dual power probably as close to perfect as a group could do at the time. And they very much atomize. So like Fred Hampton talked about this concept of like I think it was like it's like intermural or like intercommunism. So
Mm-hmm.
intercommunism is so like is the idea that like you need lots of different groups of people within communist movements to form a united front. So like if we're all advocating for the same mass line conditions, it doesn't matter whether you're an anarchist or an ML or a SOCDEM or a Democrat. We're all still or it's Huey Newton's, thank you. We're all advocating for the same thing. And that becomes very dangerous. And so the idea was is the state when the state started killing the Panthers, they went after the leaders because those were the people leading the mass line, because everyone
Mm-hmm.
knows that like mass lines historically, like we can look at this whether it's Mao or the Bolsheviks or any revolution, the mass line is a successful idea. Even the same thing like a
Well,
mass line sticky thing, so like let's go back to the Boston Tea Party for example. So like no
Well,
taxation without
before we go to
representation.
Boston, right? I guess I'm just trying to ask, like, are you arguing that the mass line was successful in this case, like that the dual
Yes, why
power?
would that not be like yes, but you have to
Okay,
put in context. Okay, but the reason why I'm saying all this is because this is historical nuance. It's incredibly important. So it's successful. So things can be successful and they can work, But
Mhm.
if the state has a apparatus on violence, or if there are outside forces that basically kill the movement, it
Mhm.
doesn't mean it's not successful. It doesn't mean that it didn't work. It just means that like there were things and roadblocks and barriers that like people didn't anticipate. I mean,
Well, sure.
a
So I
lot of
guess
these,
that the question then
but
is, right,
another
if we
thing is
know that these barriers are going to be there, we know that we do something like this and we'll be killed again. I guess the question is, what do you
here's the thing though, is I was
Mhm.
trying to answer your question, is
Sure.
the Panthers knew that they were going to die. Like a lot of people when they do revolutionary action, they're very well aware that they are like they are very well aware this is a David and Goliath story. None of these people are going into this thinking like, oh wait, we're gonna come out of this unscathed.
Mhm.
None of these things are gonna like, like they're all very well aware. I can't remember the Fred Hampton quote, but it was very much like, you basically you start being you're gonna you're born a revolutionary and you die a revolutionary of like one of those sort of effects. So the thing that I'm trying to say is like the mass line, no matter how you put it, for working class people or for people that are trying to consolidate power, is a really, really important talking point. So you need a sticky phrase. So like for the Bolsheviks, it was like peace, land, and bread.
Mhm.
I guess for like a lot of the black communists, it was the lines that the Panthers would say. I can't remember the five. It's like the 15 words that the Panthers would always say. They had it in pamphlets. They would say it all the breakfast meetings. I cannot remember this. Um, and then like the Boston Tea Party was no taxation without representation.
Mhm.
Those things are important. And so something that I think is it's when I think of mass line, when I think of Bernie, I also think of Sanders. Like there's an example that Sanders was also successful not because he was a Demsoc or a socialist or different. He spoke to the people in a manner that got people interested in politics. It doesn't necessarily have to be like when I think of socialism, I think of the social movement of the collective and using tools to get people to those points to where they can form collective action. So
Well,
like if Bernie
sure.
Sanders says like me not us, he's essentially signaling to people like or us not him or whatever. Like when because he will start
Mhm.
every meeting basically saying like I am not your leader, you guys are the leader. It is the idea that over time we as the workers or we as people that are opposing a front can get people together and do things, and then people start coming out and forming coalitions, and people that think that they know all of the things. um if you're good at X or you're good at Y, people start forming all this stuff. That's essentially like what intercommunism is. And so when most people look at socialism historically in countries, or like when people historically have always examined socialism, they're not looking at it through the lens of winning and losing and whose socialism is better. They're looking at the sort of like the long march of the revolution, like how are we getting there? And I feel like you're really stuck in this like I have a data sheet. Here's a bunch of stuff, and that's good and fine. And we
So I
could
guess the
have
question I'm
we could
trying to
make
get
like
at is, how
we
would
could
you know
have it.
whether a method is successful or not, right? Like
It's not
you're
a like
talking to this.
we can historically see something working, and then we just
How
take
would we
shit
know if
from
it's
it
working? Like,
because
how do we
people were
operationalize
liberated for
working?
X amount of years. Like I don't
Well,
like things
so the
things
question
happened.
becomes like, let's grant that like the violence of the Black Panthers like achieved success. Let's just grant this is true. It could also be true that nonviolence would have achieved more success. Right? Do you agree that this is possible?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I didn't hear it. I
So
was reading something.
even granting that like the Black Panther Party, for example, achieved success through like some modicum of violence, right? Then we could also imagine there would be even more
Well,
success through nonviolent
they didn't
methods.
use, but the Black Panthers didn't use violence. Like they weren't actively killing people. They had violence put upon them by the state.
Sure,
The Black Panthers weren't
if
an
the only thing
armed
they had to do is
revolutionary.
be
No,
killed, why did they have to be revolutionary to do so? If the only thing we need to do to get civil rights progress is sacrifice ourselves, like sacrifice a few hundred martyrs, then why do we need to be revolutionary
but the
beforehand
Black
to
Panthers
sacrifice
didn't want to
ourselves?
be martyrs. They just wanted to defend themselves. Like this is the thing too. Is like
They
historically
they
the Black.
they didn't defend themselves. They just, as you said, they just ended up killed, right? The violence was imposed upon
Well,
them.
because they couldn't, right? Even if they had guns, the state would find ways to confiscate or kill people.
Yeah, so it sounds like
Like
they didn't force the state via violence to do something, like unless you think
okay,
that
so
there was a
but
genuine
white
threat.
militia groups can also have guns, and they don't have any of their guns ever confiscated for the things that they do up until recently.
Yeah, and that's
How many
bad.
years did that take? Like you keep using the Panthers as like this weird sort of like this is unsuccessful, whatever.
No,
But
I'm
like
literally trying to like get you. So the basic idea is that something can, even granting that it's a successful like movement, the question is that something can be more successful.
It was literally called the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and they were trying to defend themselves against the hegemonic structure that is the United States. And then the state pretty much said, hey, like they were doing everything that is considered like what is considered free and democratic. They wanted just cops out of their neighborhoods. They wanted to fucking they wanted to live their own fucking lives, have their own like, self-determination, and that was forcefully taken away from them by the state because America just fucking did not think highly of black people at that
So
time.
I'm not trying to disagree with this. I'm trying to say what actually works. It's because from this perspective, you simultaneously seem to be saying that, hey, the state utterly destroyed this movement, and simultaneously that, hey, the state was forced to concede to this movement.
It's not a measurement of it working. It's an example of something that, like, if we just found a way to make this palpable again, if we could find, like, we can still use the ways and methods that they did to do these things.
Sure. So
I don't think it's necessarily it can still be used as something, as a proprietary example to give people something that is a chance to do.
So
like,
this could be, but the question is, how do we do it better?
I need to ask you because you've been asking me like 58 fucking things, so I need to make sure I understand. Like, do you think the Black Panther Party is unsuccessful, and do you consider them martyrs? Because I don't think because like you also have to like understand.
So I'm not sure. I haven't read into the particular successes or failures of the Black Panther Party. I can't speak too in depth on this issue. So all I'm trying to suggest is, before, you were talking about two things. One is like universally successful tactics, right? Which to me speaks very strongly towards empirical evidence. If you want to know what works in all cases, you can't just look at a few cases. That's literally anecdata. You need to look at as many cases as possible. And if we want to do that, then I would just mention a few studies, which is one, Chenoweth and Stefan generally finds nonviolent movements get more people. This is the second thing that you mentioned before. You said something to the tune of the Black Panther Party was on the route to success, but they couldn't get enough people involved. One of the very things that Chenoweth and Stefan 2011 find is that not only are nonviolent movements around 2 to 3 times more successful, but the main reason for this is because they are like 4 to 10 times bigger. More people are willing to put their lives, or at least their safety, on the line for nonviolent movements than violent movements because they fear less that they will be killed.
But also you have to look at who are the people involved in nonviolent movements as well. Like what are the coalitions of nonviolent movements, and like you can cite a data study that says, okay, well these nonviolent movements are successful, but who was leading them? Were they white folks that were hitching on the back of black bodies being killed and saying, hey,
so the Chenoweth and Stefan study,
or was it the fact that or was it black people that were walking around, doing a nonviolent protest? You have to also conditionally look at who was involved in these things as well, and I think that's important to know. I don't think that is necessarily completely out of the argument.
So I agree that this could be like an issue, perhaps. It's possible that certain movements are done by certain types of people, and maybe we can't replicate them. The Chenoweth and Stefan study that I'm referring to is a global one. It's just looking at nonviolent mass resistance globally. But if you want one that's specifically about the United States, there's also a study which got a little bit of fame because it got someone fired. This one. And the main finding that it had, which I know I just posted a whole bunch of stuff, and don't worry.
Fine, you Discorded it. That's fine. It's completely okay. I can read. I'll read. It's hard to read because fucking Discord doesn't pull up the picture very well.
If you look at the second picture, you can just click on it or like open a new tab or something, right? If you need to see it bigger.
Where's the attachment here? Okay, fine. Sorry, I got it. Let me pull it up and read it here.
So the main thing that this second study found, which is figure 3, is that places where there was nonviolent protest saw, and I know this isn't the be-all end-all metric for success, The places?
No, I don't think so.
The places where there was more nonviolent protest, or rather where there was one nonviolent protest, those saw an increase in votes for the Democratic Party. Those where there was violent protest saw a decrease in votes in the Democratic Party. Now, I'm not saying the Democratic Party is the only thing. This is not like socialism. It's not 2 points towards socialism or 2 points against. Though, I should be clear, the authors do argue that this was the difference between Nixon and, who was the opponent in 72? I totally forget. Nixon and Humphrey or something. So like literally the authors of this study argue that this was the difference between like a center left and a center right candidate. McGovern? I don't remember. It's been years.
Was it McGovern? I think it was McGovern. I think it's Nixon McGovern.
60. I don't know. So I guess the basic point that this study is trying to bring more generally is that it seems like people react negatively to violence. People tend to move away from movements that are violent and they move towards movements that are less violent. Or they don't get involved at all.
When have, in this entire conversation, have I advocated for violence?
Well, so we're talking about like the Black Panther Party, right? And like dual power and like organization of like militias.
They weren't violent. They were a self-defense group. They had firearms, yes, but they weren't going out and marching, trying to like occupy a government building and shoot anybody. Like, this is not like if your entire metric for the Black Panther Party is to label them as a violent insurrectionist group, they weren't. Like historically, they weren't.
So again, I don't know enough in particular about the Black Panther Party. The suggestion that I'm trying to bring is that there's kind of two. There's because there's two routes here.
Them as your example?
Sure, because there's two routes here. So one route is that hey, the Black Panther Party, and therefore, like if we're pointing to this as an example of success, something we could try to emulate in part, is don't engage in like aggressive violence, only in defensive violence. And it seems like this route, as exampled by the Black Panther Party, led to their crushing, led to their collapse. The other route seems to be
because they were black folks in America in '68. Even like if white people that did things. Oh, no, so like this is true. Like, do you know about the Weather Underground as well?
Well, sure, and they were also crushed.
Well,
right?
no, they weren't crushed. They actually, a lot of the people in the Weather Underground actually kind of like participated in sort of the violence. Like they actually did violence. So like
did it work?
You don't. Okay, so the Weather Underground was a anarchist collective group with some ML leanings, maybe. Basically, they were people that wanted to start like attacking the state directly. Like these were people that were like, hey, let's start bombing federal buildings. And they had to plead with the Panthers the Panthers hated working with them because whenever they would go out and attack stuff, they would actually end up getting the Panthers killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so like they are an example of a group that did a bunch of really, really fucked up shit, but a lot of those people got away with it. Like a lot of the people in the Weather Underground ended up actually not going to prison, not dying. A lot of them like kind of disappeared.
So let's grant. I'm trying to grant you all of this. The question is, how do we make this like not the case in the future? Right? You keep saying like you keep basically trying to say America's really, really racist, and it particularly was racist in the past. I'm not going to disagree. The question I'm trying to ask is how do we work within that? So either the options are we need to reduce racism, or we need to find a way that doesn't buy into racism. Right? We need to find a way to get around it.
That's fine, but but the issue that I'm having here is I think we're having a big like miscommunication. So let me try and bring this back here. The reason why I brought up the Panthers and the Weather Underground in particular, the reason why I'm saying that the racial inequities had to deal with this is not because I'm playing the idpol race card meme. It's because that when there were two groups of people. One wanted guns for self-defense. Mm-hmm. They wanted basically a way to have keep their determination. They wanted to find ways to keep oppressed people. They wanted a way to equalize violence of the state upon them. That was what they wanted to do. And you had another group that wanted to use violence as a way to fight the state, but they wanted to really fight the state, and they weren't doing it in a tactful manner. The Black Panthers had no intention of fighting the state. Marched on the Capitol, or like I think it was like the state building in like California or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They were just purely there to say, hey, we are here to talk about we're basically here to like stand for our rights, stand for the things that we believe in, and we're going to do, they wanted, the purpose of being armed was to protest. That's basically what that was the whole thing. The Weather Underground's idea was insurrection. And so they were the ones who, like, if someone would give them the option to do violence, or if they were like given the option to do something, they would basically do it. And when they would do these actions, a lot of people eventually, like that were more marginalized, would end up taking all the heat from the violence that they were causing. And then when this violence happens,
Well, sure.
like
So
when this violence happens, the people that generally are in different conditions got away with that. So like those people, because they were because of their
sure.
intersection,
So then what do we do about
they
that?
were doing a violent thing, which got the general population really, really scared of the idea of violence. The Black
So
Panthers were saying, "Hey, we're not here to do violence. We're here to we're just here to defend ourselves and ask for our determination." And the
so
state still killed the Panthers and let the other group that was doing the violence get away with it because of the connection of, because yes, you are correct. You are correct in the way that no one likes, the overall population does not like violence. So I'm not trying to say that what you're saying in this study is false. But what I'm saying is you're missing the context between the intersection of different groups and people. So, like, obviously, the general population is going to think, yeah, violence is bad. So, if one group is perpetuating that violence and they're getting away with the violence over and over and over again, and the black folks are
Wake
getting
up, liberal.
scapegoated by the
I love
violence,
you.
and they happen to get killed as a result of that violence, of course you're going to say that, like, oh, well, this might be unsuccessful. But it wasn't necessarily unsuccessful on the backs of them. It was unsuccessful on the backs of the things that was conditionally happening in the United States at this time.
So then I
Like,
guess the question becomes, if we're framing it as the Black Panthers were not aggressors, they were simply a militia, right?
I'm not
They were
framing it that way. It's historically that's what happened.
I'm not trying to
Like,
say that by framing it that you're wrong. I'm just trying to describe
okay,
it.
but don't say
the-
framing, because that's disingenuous, and you know that.
Sure. So I can't speak on it, so I don't know if it's true. I'm simply saying let's grant that it's true. Let's accept that it's true. So the basic thing that I'm trying to say is here it sounds like you're presenting the Black Panthers as basically not aggressing, not causing violence. And so by the very same
they
logic
didn't.
of
Like,
all
I
of the studies that I'm presenting, this would be exactly what would be necessary for them to be a successful movement. If it's actually true that the state was always the one imposing violence upon them, the title of the study is called agenda seeding. The basic idea is that when the state hurts you, it is easier for people to side with you and think that you're sympathetic. If this is true, then it should make it easier for people to sympathize with you. In fact, this was the whole point of part of the point of like MLK's protests was in part to get people to sympathize with them because they were being aggressed upon by the state. I understand that MLK was not just like a peaceful pacifist trying to work with moderates through the system. The idea is that there is an agenda here, and so I am saying like the Weather Underground seems to be very unsuccessful, and I'm not trying to disagree that like maybe when whites do bad things, some of the repercussions on that fall on black people. I'm not trying to disagree with that. The question is simply how do you work with that system? Because unless you think that you have a way to get around that,
but you can't though. Like that's the problem.
well, then you
like,
can't. So then you can't.
No,
It's as simple as that.
You can't work with that system, but the only way to work with that system is to form a mass line and an inner coalition between everybody within the collective. Like it's not really that hard to say. Like it's just something that has to be done in the United States. Like people just have to collectivize, pure and simple. It doesn't matter who it is.
Well, sure, but then the question is, how do we get
like,
there, right? Like, because we aren't there now, so how do we get there? And what I'm trying to get at is that it seems like the movements that are successful at getting there are those that tend to lean towards like an explicit nonviolence.
It involves mutual aid. It involves getting people to run in local, like state and local elections. It's involved in not putting socialist like AOC in a national Congress, but getting more people in like like unions, city councils, all those kinds of things. Localized power.
But the very point is that these are not at odds with each other. You literally, in this case, can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can elect AOC, which, as Chomsky said, takes 2 minutes. Maybe if you're in like in a poorly funded, particularly black area, it takes like 3 hours.
No, this is such a bad argument. No.
It takes very little of your time. You can do both.
It's not about chewing gum and walking at the same time. What I'm saying is the problem. Okay, so here's the issue that I'm having here. I think when I engage with most of these things in socialism, okay, so I think I understand why we're at odds with each other. So I am approaching my argument towards socialism in a really, like, whenever I talk about socialism, I try to not overly indulge in like data points too much. Not because I don't believe in data. I think data is fucking great. So like, God, I'm gonna get clipped and everyone's gonna think I fucking hate fucking data or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything wrong with data. I think data is perfectly fine. It's great. We all love it. I'm trying to, like, generally when I try and help people get to socialism, I usually talk about history and I look at historical trends and historical contexts and things that like actually like we can point to whether it was a success or a failure. These are the causalities and the results of it, right? Like these are the things that have determined and like how we have got to like points A and B and C.
Sure.
From
So
just pure historical
that's actually
context.
precisely the point. So there's this. I think that some people who don't work with data maybe don't understand the difference between a collection of facts and data. So the plural of like multiple anecdotes are not data. It has to be systematically.
I know that.
I know, and I'm not
how
trying to say that. I'm not trying to say the
they're-
otherwise. So
Okay.
the basic idea is that simply looking at a series of facts is often insufficient to tell you what the overall picture is, unless those facts are what the word here is representative. Unless we know that you're either looking at the entire sample. So what Chenoweth and Stefan try to do is look at literally every like major like of national level where the mass resistance, and they say, hey, nonviolent mass resistance seems to work better than violent mass resistance. So unless you have a universe where you have every example, or you have a representative set of events, it's very hard to know whether the data you're using is actually representative of the world as it really is. And so that's the reason why I point to these studies, because we can take things from like one or two examples, but we don't know whether they're true in general. And that's why I'm pointing to these general trends where it seems like people don't like to sign up to movements where some guy was mentioning that apparently in every pamphlet and like that the BPP published, they said that a revolutionary is a dead man, something along those lines. A lot of people don't like to sign up for that. Most people like to live boring, normal lives. And so if you want a large movement, and large movements seem to be what
But you
actually get the
also
state
have
to
but
concede, you
like,
can't do that.
right? But I think a lot of people want to live boring, normal lives because they don't have any solutions to doing anything radical because most of that education or most of those kinds of outreaches are unavailable to most people. Also, I think another thing that makes revolution impalpable is I think a lot of people are at that intersection of being like uncomfortable, for example, right? If I were to ask the average person, hey, are you willing to give up your personal comforts to make the lives of other people better? Most people will selfishly say no.
Sure.
And I think that there's something to note about that. So my overall issue with that argument about like, oh well, everyone just wants to be stable. That's what the idea of
So
socialism is supposed to reinforce, right? Like we all want stability and we all want those super boring stable lives where we can just do whatever and we don't have to have the threat of violence. We don't have to think of like evictions or capitalism or all those fucking shits.
So
Um
I guess what I'm trying to say is most people are boring, and I think the suggestion that you're giving is, hey, we can simply activate them, but it doesn't seem like this is actually the case. There's a
Well,
variety
but
of
it's
lines
not.
of evidence
I
that.
don't. No. 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 I don't. I don't think. I don't. I'm not talking about. I don't think. I don't think at all we can activate people. That's not how I think about revolution. Like even in the slightest.
Well, you're talking about like giving them a class consciousness so that they know that they can actually do things and like care less about the boring life
No.
and
It's
actually dedicate themselves
it's
to the
no.
cause, right?
No. It's just making people aware of things because I think if people aren't
Well,
aware
aware.
of how bad things
Liberals
are,
want to make
like,
people aware of things. Like if you literally just want to make people aware of things, you should love AOC. She's saying capitalism bad on Twitter.
yeah,
Right?
but that's
As
right.
much practice as most like MLMs have in the United States. Like, come on.
Okay. I mean, that's fair. And like that's what I'm saying. Like I think that phrases like just saying capitalism bad is a incredibly boring platitude. And like we can all agree. We can all agree with that, right? Like I think even like anyone saying capitalism bad is a silly dichotomy, right?
So I guess the thing that I'm trying to point to, and I sent you, it's a little anecdote, but there's a lot of other lines of data which lead to the same thing. It's this old deleted tweet from Anarcho Pack. I think she renamed herself. And it tells this story of a little workers' library that was made in Hamburg. And in Hamburg, they had a whole bunch of books from Marx. They had a whole bunch of books from like the contemporary 1890s German worker movement. And it turns out that virtually no one was checking out the books. Only 12% of shop assistants checked out books, and it was even lower for other professions. And those who did check out the books were mostly checking out fiction. So the Count of Monte Cristo, which is like a fiction book about, I think, a vampire or something, was checked out like 217 times.
How is this relevant to that
This is like
conversation?
a simple example to show people don't like to read theory. They don't like to do political activism. They don't even like to read nonfiction.
Dude, that's fine. I know this. I'm not like.
But then the question is,
I feel like he would just assume that I am this like innocuous person that just thinks that everyone needs to just fucking read theory and activate the fucking secret proletariat. Like I don't talk to regular, like I live in the Rust Belt in middle America. I have had more success just having very casual conversations about socialism than any fucking debate I have ever gone at.
well, sure. And so that's actually the second thing that I was going to talk
People
about.
that I've talked to on these I don't all of these things that I've ever talked about are really tangible to people that don't understand the concepts of socialism. Like I think that it's just as bad to like fucking bring data sheets to people to like to convince people that like being left is better than being right, like even
Sure.
based on
So
that.
the second
Like
thing that I was going to
like,
try and bring.
it's also about tailoring. It's also about tailoring things to like some people do need data. So like I honestly, so honestly, like I'll be truth. Like really, it's honest. Like some people do need fucking boring data fact sheets. Like some people's brains just the fucking way they are. Like if you need a data sheet, that's perfectly fine. If you need theory to get you to a place, that's completely fine. If you need a combination of both, that's completely fine. I think the problem with socialism is so many people are trying to find these one step, one fits all solutions to things, and I don't think that is how you should ever materially look at socialism, which is why this conversation is incredibly fucking difficult, because I think you're trying to like find this like really hard-lined prescriptive idea that I have I don't like I'm not I have never presented myself as a girl with solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I've always presented myself as here are things that can help you get to places that you need to be. I don't necessarily like have this I there are things that I have my personal prescriptions, and then I have things that I say to people. So when I usually say things to people, I try to be as general, and I try to like be as understanding with how people are seeing the world, because I do know that some people, if you grow up in the United States, if you grow up in like a white rich suburb, you're going to think of geopolitics completely different than someone who is white and poor living out in like rural America. There is adamantly a disconnect. The reason why socialism is not successful in the United States is because there are so many different geographic and cultural zeitgeists that make us all completely different. And so there is no one size fits all solution. And I think the reform way of just kind of doing it slowly to get us slowly all on the same page is like my issue with reform is that it is too slow for some people, but it's perfect for others. So like some people, when they look at reformed revolution, they like that because they don't have to give up anything, because they'll eventually they can stay in the system and get what they want. If you are someone that is incredibly marginalized and it has like almost nothing, and you're already getting crumbs from the system, you don't have time to sit here and fucking wait for reform to eventually help you.
Okay.
That's you know.
So there's kind of three points that have been raised here. Before this goes even further. So the first thing I wanted to mention, I wasn't just trying to say that people don't like to read theory. There's a general point here. One of the books I constantly recommend is Politics is for Power by Hirsch, because one of the big things that the book will tell you, and I'll send a link real quick, one moment. Hirsch. One of the big things that the book will tell you is that most people don't like to be politically involved. There's similarly an article here from The Atlantic, which the headline statistic is that only 1% of Americans are really politically active. Now here, being really politically active means doing 8 activities in, I think, like a given year or something, which is not actually that many. It's 1 activity a month.
Yeah, super small.
But it can mean stuff like doing things, like volunteering or attending rallies and so on. Even if you're just looking at more generally, people who are willing to do 4 activities, which literally means like donate money, volunteer in your committee, write and call your elected officials, very low bars. About 10% of people actually are willing to do it. So what I'm trying to suggest here, this is on the first point, is that it seems like it is hard probably to activate a lot of people to genuinely be so interested in this movement that they're willing to like dedicate themselves to stuff like BPP. It's a very small portion of people that you're talking about here. The second point, let me just go through this before we get
sure.
to the next bit.
No, sure.
So the second bit was that where was it? I typed it in chat. The second bit was that you mentioned how you aren't the girl with the solutions, right? So I think precisely that is more or less the point of what I'm trying to do. It's that the goal is to move beyond just knowing what socialism is, knowing communism, and knowing that we want to get there. The goal is precisely on trying to figure out what the steps we want to do to get there is. And so the reason that I use data isn't actually about persuading people. Not per se. There's a decent chunk of evidence that data and empirics and logic and even humor and emotion, all of these things actually are reasonably effective at changing people's minds. There isn't one solution which seems to be the best. And I have another study on that if you want to read that. So the reason that I bring data up in these conversations is because I want to try and be scientific. It's for my benefit as much as yours. I want to genuinely know what the best solution is. And so when I look at the data that says, hey, nonviolence seems to be more successful, that's why I adopt it. I follow the data into like what seems to work. And the final thing that you mentioned is about time frame. I just got to do the last thing. So the final thing you mentioned is time frame. I think revolution is really hard to achieve in the United States. If you think that we're more likely to get stuff like a solution to climate change or like desperate poverty via revolution in the United States than we are via reform, when we're literally even seeing like the left liberals and the Democratic Party possibly be passing one of the biggest anti-poverty bills of like our lifetimes, I don't think that is a very reasonable assertion to think that we're going to get revolution in like 5 years or 20 years. It just seems very unlikely.
Right. Yeah. I don't personally like think that like revolution like is actually going to happen. I'm not someone that like thinks of that, right? So like I guess like point number I guess I'll just kind of I'm gonna do these out of order. So like when I say that I don't have solutions, it's not that I'm uninterested in solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's like a lot of people they're not even there. Like their brain isn't even like most people like they're not where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
Like you are also working from a framework that 90% of people are not actually at.
Sure.
So like it's hard like whenever I talk to people like when I slowly start to talk to people at work about unions or whenever I talk to anybody about anything on the left, um it's it's really quite it's like half of the people that I talk to completely agree with everything that I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Like they understand like where the ills are with inequalities, whether it's racial or financial or whatever. Like they completely understand. And then there are people that completely fucking hate it. Like everything is bad. Like this is not a solution. You know, we all know these things, right? It's the meme. Um
I don't know if I sent you a little meme. Just speaking, I guess what you're talking about.
I've actually like never, I'm not the kind of person that does that. Like, I never tell people, like, I never use the word communism.
Well,
And I
no.
don't ever like,
The point of this meme is actually precisely what you were saying, that most people tend to agree with economic left-wing policies. They don't like the
right,
word
yeah,
socialist.
yeah, I know. And like, and here's the thing, like, I think the word socialism and communism has such a negative connotation, like, because of McCarthyism and because of the Red Scare and
Sure.
because of a lot of the anti-communist propaganda. So I don't necessarily think inherently the
Wake
word
up,
socialism or
liberal. I
communism
love you.
is a bad word. And I don't necessarily think it can't be recontextualized to be used in the United States. I think a lot of people just assume that like you can't use the C word or the S word, which I think is silly. I think it's perfectly fine to call yourself a fucking communist and use that as a launching point to talk about your belief systems, right? So like
Sure.
I very much hate LARPy things. Like I'm not a huge fan of like the LARP. The LARPiest thing that I have is this fucking stupid flag in the background that
Mm-hmm.
everyone like keeps assuming I'm like a tanky and like people in chat call it cringe or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I say this to everybody. I put this flag up on purpose. It's basically to get people to ask me fucking shit. So if I stick this dumb flag up there,
Mm-hmm.
people will ask me about the things that I believe in, and I will get the most bad faith questions. I will get the most ridiculous fucking shit,
Mm-hmm.
and I will try and answer them to the best of what I am given with, because I really think um that at least having base level conversations with people about socialism is a way to sort of reinforce the mass collective line. Like if you can get the general populace more on board with socialist ideas, you can get people to decide whether they like it. If that makes more sock dems, that's perfectly fine. I am actually with the idea that if we had a Luxembourg-esque, SOCDEM revolution where we contrived entire amounts of electoral and political power. Like if we did dual power completely electorally, so if we did state, local, national, and just got a million fucking socialists within offices and we just took everything,
Hmm.
yeah, 100%. I'm totally behind that. I have no issues with that. Like, I'm not someone who is against that idea. I get really frustrated when people just assume that, like, because I am more for the idea of vanguardism as a concept, it doesn't mean I dismiss, I don't know, fucking socialist politicians or any of those things. Like, I don't necessarily think, I don't think that, like, doing anything, like, doing a SOCDEM sort of soft power takeover as like how like
So,
Rosa and like a lot of those people in the
and I
SDF
guess
like
the
wanted to do.
question becomes, right, like the question to me, I guess, is twofold. If the main goal that you're talking about right now is not even organizing any dual power, the goal is not even to do stuff like the Black Panthers Party, it is literally just evangelizing, it's literally just persuasion, literally just talking to people, then how is this distinct?
I'm saying that is something that everyone needs to start doing at the base level.
Well, sure,
Like
and everyone does it, and then that's actually the point. What is the difference between this and a reformist agenda? When do we
Right,
diverge?
most people can't. But SDL, like most people can't even do the evangelism part. Most people can't even do that. Like
I think
so,
they
like
can.
I don't
They aren't, but
expect
they can.
people to. I don't even expect people to advocate for socialist policy because like most people that advocate for socialist policy like don't even know the history of what socialist policy is. So like they don't even know where
Well,
these things come
sure,
from.
but
You
then it sounds
actually
like our
know,
role is
but
like evangelizing, right? It's just persuasion.
you know these things though. Like this is the thing. It's like you're operating from a very specific framework, which is why this conversation is frustrating because it's like you're operating from a really specific place.
Well, I
And
guess,
I
well,
don't
I
think
guess I'm
that
trying to ask,
many
like, what
people
is the difference
I
then?
don't
What is the difference
I
between our
don't
frameworks that like leads you to eventually lead to some different activity? I'm not entirely sure what the difference in activity ultimately is, but what is the difference in our framework which would lead us to different activities somewhere down the line? If in the short term we're both just SOCDEM activists de facto on the street, we're just evangelizing SOCDEM, evangelizing, making the term socialist good again, right?
I'm not a sock dem.
I know, but that's de facto what you're doing. You're normalizing a move to the left, right? If that's
But that
like,
doesn't that's not normalizing leftism isn't necessarily inherently sock dem.
well,
How
I
is that
mean,
sock
previously,
dem?
very early in the conversation, you were talking about the mass line in terms of fulfilling people's needs and passing stuff like healthcare and poverty reduction, which sounds to me very much like a move towards social democracy, right?
The mass line is not necessarily inherently a social or it's not inherently a
Well,
social
yeah,
democracy
but you talked about using the
based on
mass line
social
to identify
democracy.
people's needs and then like fulfilling them by achieving political power through like conventional means, right? Which seems to be like in the short term, like persuading people to be SOCDEMs.
But it's specifically dual power because you can't even have reformist programs without dual power. Like
Sure.
the idea that like reformist like if okay, so do you think okay, so let me ask you this. Let me make sure I understand your position. Do you
Hmm.
think that reform is possible without dual power?
No.
Okay,
I
cool.
mean,
Okay, cool. Okay.
you could actually.
No,
No, I
no,
mean,
yes, no, no, yes or no.
so you could argue. So like literally, I was thinking of what's his face. Who's the Iron Chancellor? Um,
Wilhelm II.
No, I think that's the emperor. Bismarck
Uh,
was like
oh
literally.
no, was it Bismarck?
Bismarck
Okay,
was an anti-socialist who didn't have like
right.
electoral or I guess you could say there was some degree of dual power, but like socialists were very weak in Germany. But he explicitly passed reforms to like try and mollify them, which I think due to my like, belief about like policy acquisition, I think probably actually hurt him. But whatever, it's a separate discussion. It's like technically yes, but I think that the vast majority of times you're talking about a composition,
But I
cooperation
mean,
between dual
he was
power and
also doing
electoral
it.
power.
But he was doing those liberal reforms to appease people to keep himself in power. Like we know that,
Yeah,
right?
the problem is that appeasement doesn't actually seem to be much of a real thing. There's some degree of appeasement in like the Saudi states, where like they just give people money, but that's because they have insane resources at their
Right.
hands.
I don't
And when you're
necessarily.
talking
Yeah,
about like when
I'm
you're
not a
talking about
fan of,
like
like appeasement. I think appeasement is silly.
well,
Like,
no,
I
no,
know
I'm
most
saying
people
that some
think
people,
so too.
some people more towards the like pure revolutionary anti-reform side of things seem to say that these sorts of things are appeasement and they actually reduce people's willingness to be revolutionary. Um, So I'm just trying to stress. I don't think this is actually true. There's a lot of evidence, at least in my mind, that when you pass policies, it actually changes people's perceptions as well. It is harder to get rid of people's healthcare in Britain because they have such a strong healthcare program there. Similarly, unions declined less in social democratic countries than in non-social democratic countries because unions are normal there. You can literally change how people think about the world via policy. So I guess I'm just to return to the point. I guess I'm just trying to ask so we've almost got to about the hour and a half point, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly is different in our advocacy, and when will it show up? When will we no longer be working on the same project as a reformist and more leaning towards revolution, I suppose, or more leaning towards a vanguardist approach? What's going to differentiate us?
I never even had a chance to fucking define vanguardism. This conversation is I don't know how we got. This was very unstructured.
Sure. Do you want to define
it? I feel like we should have structured this way more because it was very much kind of I don't know. I feel like I did really shitty in this. It was pretty last minute too. I'm sorry. I should have been better. I should have framed my entire fucking thing about vanguardism before we got, because I didn't I really fucking kind of hate the reform versus revolution thing because it seems to be such a I don't think there should be that much contention about it, honestly. Um the only critique I have about reform and revolution is I think that nationalizing the idea of the vote is bad. So putting all your cards basically, how do I put this? Basically throwing all your cards in for Biden to soft power fix everything is not a good solution to
Mm-hmm.
problems. I do think that was but I understand that in terms of harm reduction or in terms of keeping people alive, perfectly fine. Um I think I probably should have entirely. I guess maybe we can have a second discussion and actually talk
Sure.
about vanguardism, because we basically just talked about reform revolution, not vanguardism. So I'm not even going to bring up vanguardism because we can just have a completely separate conversation about that.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of reform versus revolution, I still to this I still, every time I have these conversations, I
Mm-hmm.
always feel like they're moot because I am very much in the middle. So I don't know if you saw Vosh's conversation with Akeem about
Mm-hmm.
reform versus revolution, or saw
Didn't
their
watch it.
discussion.
I just knew that he supported unequal exchange, which I do not. But okay,
What'd you say again? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
it's irrelevant. I didn't see the conversation.
Okay. I think you should watch that because I know you might. I don't know if you like Vosh or Hakeem or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but basically my idea of reform and revolution is always going to be this: you need dual power, pure and simple. Whatever way
Wake
gets
up,
us to dual
liberal.
power is
I love
what
you.
we need to do. That's how I view the stair step to socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the the complex part about building dual power is through historical perspective. So the reason why I brought up the Black Panther Party is because they are sort of this group that had a really huge amount of success, but completely were flatlined by the state. But there are contextual reasons why that happened, and there were happenings with various groups of people around them
Mm-hmm.
that is why it happened. And I was historically trying to get into that with you because it was important. Now, if we want to individually talk about the data between a nonviolent and a violent revolution, that is also a separate conversation. I think the problem is we were trying to have three different conversations all at once, and we kind of jumped on each other, and I was a little confused about your framing and you were a little confused about my framing. So
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to have more conversations to flesh this out. Because I actually don't really know every single belief and practice that you hold. So this can be messy. You can put this up on your fucking channel if you
Mm-hmm.
want. Um, it's perfectly fine. Everyone can fucking make bad memes and clip me. I don't really care. But
Mm-hmm.
I really
Well, I hope
actually
they don't.
if we wanna I do think that context is also matter, right? So I don't think we can take what the Black Panther Party did and put that now. I don't believe in this sort of copy and paste thing.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of leftists that think all we have to do is just copy what they did and do it and it will work. I don't think that, because we live in a different
Mm-hmm.
era, we have different circumstances, and we have different things. Um
Sure.
what I think is super important that we can both agree on is how do we fight the state and how do we fight the state successfully? Um and so I'm really interested in what you view the state as, because I think if we're going to talk about the state, I would need to know what your definition of the state is and how you feel about the state. So my definition of the state is basically the stakeholders who own capital, the stakeholders who own, the means of production. The state is the monopoly on violence. So even if a communist group held all those things, that is still the state, and I still don't necessarily like it.
Hmm.
So, as much as I like centralized economies, I don't view a centralized economy as the state, because a centralized economy is just a bureaucratic measure to extradite wealth. So
Sure. So
when I think of like Walmart and Amazon, for example, run on centralized economies. So, for example, they are intrinsically, using a kind of partially a mode, like they're using a mode of production in a way. The way they're bureaucratically aligned is centralized, and it's effective. It makes them fucking fuck tons of money because capitalism. Um, but I would argue that like Bezos and a lot of the CEOs are still considered part of the state apparatus, because they actively give money to politicians. They actively have, things intrinsically, things involved with capital that are all together. So like,
mhm.
those things are essentially part of the state, and I don't like any of those things. So I guess I guess as long as I understand like what your definition of how you view the state is, and if we agree on what state apparatuses are, like I think we can have an easier conversation of coming to the solution of how do we get rid of those things.
Sure. So I guess then the question is, did you want to wrap this up around now, or did you want to keep
Uh,
going? Up to you. It seemed like you
I
were.
think we can do like 10 minutes. Like we can how about we do like we'll end this at 9, and how about we just do the last like 15 or so minutes of, if chat
Mhm.
wants to ask questions, we can fucking meme and say some dumb shit. Like it doesn't have to be serious. Like I'm a real person. I like laugh at shit all the time. Like I mean like
Well, I guess
I don't know. Like if
just
there's
on.
anything like fun you want to ask me, or like I'll ask you fun things. Like if you
Well,
like I think next time we have a conversation, we should, because I feel like you just asked me to talk about vanguardism and reform revolution, and we just kind of like we didn't there was no we didn't I didn't know your side.
mhm.
So I had no fucking idea what like you believed in, right? So like I even said it in a Twitter DM, like I don't know what you believe in. So like I don't really know how to have this conversation.
Mhm.
So I think if we, I don't know, maybe like next week or something, we'll just talk about vanguardism. So we could do like an hour and a half, and we'll just like, if you want to read about vanguardism or something in your time or whatever, we can actually do that. And
Wake
I think
up,
that will be
liberal.
better for
I
chat, better
love
for
you.
everybody else, and better for the conversation, because I'd like to talk to you again about stuff. I think this is really interesting. So
Sure. I mean, I guess just on the state note, so like two things. One, saying I'm a real person, kind of sus. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Miss Robot. Two, I guess I think that the classic Marxist conception of dictatorship of the bourgeois or dictatorship of the proletariat is far too binary. Precisely, I think part of the work of people like Ajamoglu is pointing out that these institutions are controlled by a variety of often competing powers. So the classic idea that basically one of the big theories of not Ajamoglu, but Ajamoglu adjacent is that historically the big powers have been like the common people, have been like traders, have been industrialists, and have been agriculturalists. And often the all four hate each other, and they have like varying policies. Agriculturalists often want tariffs, so often too do industrialists, depending on the type of agriculture. But other agriculturists want everything exported. So I think that thinking of it as like a purely class thing doesn't actually seem to be the most productive way to think about these things. But that's somewhat regardless. The basic way that I think about the state, if you want to think about it in like one axis perspective, is how much power the common people, meaning like the workers generally, have. And I think one of the things that we've seen over time is that that has expanded. People today have much more power over democracy than they do in like 1649 in like Britain. And so we've seen this gradual increase of like worker power over time. And so I think that I don't conceive of the state as like Jeff Bezos or like the capitalist class collectively runs it. There seems to be a lot of reason to believe that the way people vote and democracy at large does have a
oh yeah.
meaningful impact on how the state functions. So
Yeah, I don't
yeah.
I don't like I don't I also personally like don't think that like it's just I okay, so like I very much hate the meme of like the fucking CEO sitting in the boardroom like with the triangle hands, like how do I take money from poor
Wake up,
people?
liberal. I
I
love you.
completely agree. I don't think that that is the way to look at it.
Well, sure.
It's like
Um,
way more it's like way, yeah, no, I actually agree with that point. Like I think I don't think anyone should. I think the dictatorship of like I really think that the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is a good thing to keep in mind when we're talking about how state power has been collectivized with capital. But I don't necessarily think to say. I think it is also bad to implicitly imply that like corporations control everything.
Hmm.
I do think corporations have a lot of influence in politics, and we all know that that's bad. Like anyone can say that that's bad. Doesn't matter what you politically believe in, historically, empirically, data wise. Like we all know that that's just not good TM. Which is
Hmm.
we all aware that like it's a thing that should end, and we all have different means to get rid of that. Like there's like election, what is it like a like
Sure, stuff like publicly
fucking getting
funded
rid of like the
elections.
thing like a
Yeah.
super PAC, I guess. Like money
Hmm.
in politics.
Sure. Well,
But I don't necessarily consider that like entirely just out of pure class dictatorship. I do think that's a
Wake up,
really
liberal.
like moot,
I
like
love you.
kind of just dumb thing to say. Like unless you want to just like I don't know. I don't. I'm glad you know.
mhm.
I'm glad I don't think that. That's a little. I try to
So I
not. I'm
guess
not. I'm not a classical Marxist. So.
as a closing question, and then I'll make you shill again. So as a closing question, would you agree with the words of the immortal science of Medlockism that on the streets you are a activist for SOCDEM and DemSOC policies, but in the sheets behind the curtains you are a vanguardist?
Uh, I kind of not really like so. I agree with SOCDEM policies to a point because I like when I think of current like the SOCDEM policies right now, I think of them as just like stopgaps, right?
Hmm.
So like they're just things that people are doing because they're the most measurable and correct thing that we can do, like at the idea at the background. Also, everyone can be shitting. Okay, I need to like get rid of these Funko Pops. I actually collected all of them, like at a convention, and I've been trying, and I know that there's nerds that really, really like Funko Pops, and I might actually end up selling them. So like I'm trying to get that, but COVID's kind of fucked my ability to sell them to weird nerd Funko Pop collectors, which is why I keep them in the boxes. There are people that I shit you not, like they have a fucking economy. Like there are people that will buy like some of these ones that I own are like they're
Red
misprints
Charlotte,
or there's
who I
something
can
there's
tell
something
you
like
is a
wrong with
massive
them.
weeb nerd, says to sell them on Depop, which I don't know what is.
Okay, I'll look at that. I mean, I need to sell them. Like, I don't necessarily like them.
It's
I
okay.
think
We
these are like
understand that you're just
normal
trying to run
4K.
cover for your
It.
pop addiction. Okay, we understand.
I only have that's the ones that I own. I think total I've spent on Funko Pops. I think is about $300, and some of them are worth way more than that. So I might actually end up selling them because
Sounds
people
like you
like them.
two are a bourgeois trader.
Yeah, always. I love being a class trader.
Wake up,
Um,
liberal. I love you.
I mean, I generally believe in communism, like unironically, but like I don't like to talk about it. I always try to talk about like a not like stupid way because I don't think it's like it's and I don't like really hate sock dems or anything. Like, yeah, I know everyone on my like I know I make fun of them on Twitter all the time. I don't like virulently hate them as people.
Hmm.
Um, like if you're a sock dem, it's just like whatever. I just feel like a lot of people are gonna be sock dems because like we live in the United States. It's a pretty, it's a very palpable version of the left.
Hmm.
Um, it's a solution that a lot of the average person in certain conditions might see as a positive. So like, do I want everyone to fucking be, great I don't know, like Lenin loving fucking MLs, like it'd be cool, but like,
Hmm.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not here to like tell everyone what they need to politically believe in, I guess. Like
Well, I'm
I'm
glad.
basically just like here to agitprop people into socialism, and I would hope people would pick my side at the end of the day. But that's really that's basically my prescription that I always talk about.
Well, I'm glad we've made peace between ChaosIsMel and the SOCDEMs of the world.
Yeah, no, I mean
Mel,
I
would
think it's dumb to
you?
like walk around and basically just say, I hate all these fucking people. I mean, like I'll jokingly meme about it all the time. Like if there are sock dems, like there are genuine sock dems that like literally think that I just like want to put everyone in a gulag and shit. I'm like, come on, guys, like really, like this is silly. Like I have
Well,
I have more of
speaking
an
of
issue
your
with
gulag, would
policies
you like to
and
shill?
practices than I do with like people that like an ideology, right? So like I hate like even like MLs that just like want to put people in gulags for whatever reason, or like MLs that think that like being trans is like his like immaterial to Marxism, like those fucking nerds. So like I really do like have issues with like fringe anyone that has like some weird fringe take in leftism. Doesn't matter whether you're a Marxist Leninist or a fucking sock dem. Like if you have some dumb fuck take about how something is, like it's real dumb.
Well, speaking of nerds, with dumb fuck takes, would you like to shill who you are, what you do, and where people can find you?
Oh Jesus, yeah, hell yeah, dude, I'm a dumb fuck. All right. Hi everyone, my name's Melanie. I basically just fucking sit on the internet and eventually show up to these interviews really, 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 really unrehearsed and talk about communism. I'm actually probably I'm decently well spoken and okay well read. I would like to talk to Sockdem or socially done left. I want you to Sockdem done left.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, we're gonna have another conversation, but yeah, you can basically follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is ChaosIsMel. Basically, I'm just a personality that's obnoxious and does a lot of dumb, shitty, cringy things. Um, you know, I hope I'm the best communist y'all like. So even if you hated this conversation, please follow me on Twitter. I post cool stuff. I'm I'm just a fucking really exciting commie trans girl from Middle America. That's my shill. Eventually I'm gonna do a Twitch stream.
Well, good
I'm
luck.
probably just like gonna play games. It's gonna be like a variety thing. I'm not gonna like talk about politics too much. Maybe I'll actually talk about politics later, but maybe I'll go back into the panel scene and maybe go back on the hippy tippy or something once in a while. But I don't know. That's really it.
I wish you the best of luck.
I wish you all the best of luck.
And thank you for a lovely evening. I hope that this didn't mess up your sleep schedule for your work tomorrow too much.
No,
and,
my fucking sleep schedule is permanently fucked, so I just kind of deal with it. But anyway, what was I gonna say? Yeah, let's actually have a more structured conversation so we don't feel like because I feel like I don't know anything that you believe in.
Mhm.
And I think that like I don't think you understood anything of where I was coming from either. I think we very much had a incredibly disjointed conversation.
Fair enough.
Because I don't think I think we diametrically disagree on a lot of things. I think in this conversation we just disagreed with them in a way that wasn't productive. Like I think we were talking past each other a lot. So I'm gonna take the L here and
Mhm.
say, hey, if I was talking past you, real sorry, because I didn't really know your positions and I wasn't trying to assume your positions, but like usually like when people say certain words,
Mhm.
I'm assuming that's where they're coming from because I hear these things a lot towards me. And I just think we just need to have more conversations. I don't know. You can follow me on
Sure.
Twitter because you don't follow me on Twitter, you fucking coward.
Well, if you'd like to suggest a more structured topic, I'd be happy to hear it. I hope you have a lovely rest of the evening. Thanks for coming
Yeah,
on.
let's talk about vanguardism next time.
Tschüss.
All right, love you, buddy. You're the best.
Good night. All right. Mandatory post-conversation recap. The cat's name is Maggie. She's out of the room. I'm not Sockdem done left. Before we get too far from the conversation, I did want to thank a few people who were here. Someone named Anonymous Cheerer used 100 bits. I don't know what that is. I don't know what is that, like a bot or something? I think Lucifer followed. I don't know who that is, but I think I've seen their name before. Senpai Chow and Comrade Clevername rated. Thanks to you, Senpai Chow and Comrade Clevername. And who was the last person who did something? Hunter Kinda Bad subscribed. Wow, what good shilling. I'm once again asking you to post the meme folder. I will never upload the meme folder, okay? Not only because it has all of my templates, which I use, okay, to streamline the production of memes, which I don't want you trolls to have. I need to own the means of meme production. But, because it's really, really big. He chose to remain anonymous? Oh, I guess so. I could upload it someday. I could probably put it on Google Drive. So, post-conversation recaps. I kind of gave my standard arguments for reform, which is that it seems like it's been occurring over time. I know some people have pointed out that just because there have been positive changes in the past doesn't mean there will be positive changes in the future. That's a fair point. I think the reasons for these changes over time are due to structural reasons. That's precisely the reason I point to Acemoglu and Robinson so frequently, because they argue that that it is for structural reasons that we've seen the expansion of democracy. Like democracy didn't expand around the world just because. It expanded because it is structurally more stable and structurally more suited to like industrial production. Sort of, ironically, weirdly enough, a Marxist approach, a material historical analysis. So I think that there's reason to believe a lot of these reformist tendencies will tend to increase over time. One of the big ones is rising education and the increased expansion of like the worker class. Thanks to Insane Jeffafa for subscribing with Prime Gaming. This is your reminder to everyone that when you subscribe with Prime, it costs you nothing, but it costs Jeff Bezos $3. Is that not a reason to subscribe? For Mel, I think she took, they're basically three broad positions that people tend to take. Mine is the more like reform, not use of like more violent tactics. She took the like all on the table approach, and there are some people who eschew reformist tactics. So she took the middle approach, which is that you'd be willing to. I'll tell you the name with one moment. Cosmere Phoenix. She took the middle approach, which is inclusive of all of them. And so that one is, I think, harder to argue against for both sides because it's less likely. Yeah, it's as spelled in chat. I can send this specific article. Basically, that one's harder to argue against because they aren't willing to eschew reformism. For example, I've talked to some people who explicitly say, like, hey, giving the poor healthcare makes them less likely to support the revolution. And that's, I think, an absurd position, but also it's very easy to see the clash between those positions. Instead, the common position that you'll get is people who say, I'm willing to do reform as long as it produces results. But then there will become a point at which reform no longer produces results, and then we need to abandon it and become revolutionaries. I don't believe that either, which is why I'm more a reformist. I don't think that there's a point at which that will occur, but it's hard to know whether that's true because we've never experienced a point close to that yet. So I think Mel was taking that position, but I don't think that she elucidated it very clearly. Perhaps that was due, as she said, this was not a very structured conversation. Perhaps I should have come in here with more structured comments. I think that could be something to note in general. I think I've been trying to get better at holding people to positions and not just letting us like move on to the next conversation. I tried to do that in this conversation somewhat unsuccessfully. Maybe that would have provided more structure. But again, hard to know in retrospect. Let's see. My basic argument then is I don't think that there's a reason to believe that there's a point at which reform will fail. And if there is, then I guess I would have to abandon it because I want a world where more people are given more prosperity. And if the only way to achieve that is through a method that I'm not currently advocating, I'll have to change. The article that I'm constantly referring to with reference to Acemoglu and Robinson is called The Narrow Corridor. I think you can find that on b-ok.org, b-ok.org. The Narrow Corridor, Acemoglu and Robinson. This one isn't specifically about like how industrialization like helps democracy, but I'm pretty sure in chapters 13 through 15, they explicitly discuss how the rise. No. I want to say it's chapters 14 and 15, where they explicitly discuss how the rise of industrial means of production and the need for educated workers has helped drive democracy upwards, which I think is a very interesting structural argument about why democracy has risen everywhere in the world, even in countries that used to be like very little history of democracy, like South Korea and Taiwan. So I think it's a really interesting argument. Yeah, that's, I guess, my summary. What else? I think one person thought that I was saying that industrialists were the common people. No, one of the basic points that Acemoglu and other authors, like one of the authors that I had in development economics, he published a whole article on how often the agricultural class and the industrial class are very much at odds. So, for example, they pointed to South Africa, Acemoglu and Robinson, where the agricultural and the extraction industries both want a uneducated and mollified populace, much like the Sauds want in their country. Is it the House of Sauds? I don't know if there's like a PC way to say that. Just like the people who run Saudi Arabia, they want a dumb, stupid, pacified populace. Just like the agriculturalists and extraction industries in South Africa, they want cheap mining labor and they want cheap farming labor, and they don't want that labor to resist. And so that's part of the reason why apartheid developed. It's so that you would have a race of people who were structurally unable to get education, and so they would be forced to be cheap agricultural labor, and they would be unable or less able to organize because they don't have the education, connections, resources, and so on to do so. In contrast, industrialists in South Africa very much opposed apartheid. apartheid, allegedly, according to Ajamoglu. And maybe there's more complex history that I don't know here. I've just read Ajamoglu and Robinson on this one. They say that they opposed it because they actually wanted educated workers, and they couldn't get that from like the hyper uneducated collapse of not collapse, the hyper uneducated populace that the agriculturalists and the extraction industries wanted. And so, in fact, they assert that the industrialists sided with the anti-apartheid regime, which was very interesting. And one of the things that we saw as a result of that is the big industries literally made a bargain, where they gave a lot of black people control of some businesses so that they would have buy-in to the system after apartheid ended. You